All right, hi guys. This is going to be the second part of the lecture for this week. Now, in the last lecture, I began to raise some issues: paternalism versus autonomy, paternalism versus libertarianism. In both of those, it is the terms connotate autonomy. I'm sorry, paternalism would carry the connotation of someone telling you what to do. And that doesn't mean giving you instructions the way we do in a course. Um, it would be as if I said to you outside of this course, you really need to do, you really have to do this, or you must do this. Um, Actually, no, you know what? I think it is. Now that I think about it, no, paternalism does apply within the course. The college has, I think there's a legal term for it, in locus parente. It means in absence of your parents, even though you're of majority age, they have a responsibility to be sure that you're doing and taking certain and they have a certain responsibility for you. Um, there's a certain paternalism when it comes to this course, in that I can tell you what to do and what you must do. Um, and so that is, it is a reality now that I think about it. Yeah, there is a certain amount of paternalism in the course. But then also, um, the other term that I brought up was autonomy or libertarianism. Autonomy and libertarianism has to do with your freedom, your personal freedom. Now, in the country in which we live, we walk a fine line here. There are certain things that we've said that the government can tell you that you must do. Um, but because we enjoy our freedoms, we've said, oh, but there are some things that we would never abide, we would never allow the government to tell us to do. Now, how do we distinguish between which is which? Um, the government tells us that we must wear a seatbelt, but it can't tell us that you must wear a mask. Now, if I wear a seatbelt or if I don't wear a seatbelt, the only person that I would harm is myself, most likely. Whereas if I'm an asymptomatic carrier of COVID, it's not myself that I'm harming, it's other people. So you see where there's a disconnect there. The government would make a law about what I can, what I can't do in my own automobile, but it won't make a law about what I, you know, can do when I walk down the street in the middle of a pandemic. So there's a real disconnect there in some ways uh, between how we understand paternalism and autonomy. The other way to think about this, or another approach to this, is risk and responsibility. What amount of risk are you willing to take versus what amount of responsibility do you have? Now, one of those areas, so we talked about vaccines and masks in the last segment. One of the other areas of that is when it comes to the use of drugs and alcohol. Let's just put it out there, because the most widely used drug is alcohol. It's also the most abused of all the drugs. And we know that from from decades of experience, that alcohol is a drug and it is often abused. But it is legal. And there are some who would argue that alcohol has a more deleterious effect both to the individual's body and also to society as a whole, has a more deleterious effect than something like marijuana. I've put it to someone called me one time and they were quite concerned that they had discovered that their child had marijuana in their backpack. And this kid was like a senior in high school. And my response was, oh, thank God it wasn't alcohol. Um, because alcohol tends to have a worse effect on us than does something like marijuana, or at least there are some people who would argue that. So when it comes to drugs, why do we tolerate, why do we allow the government to tell us that some drugs should be illegal? One of those, one of the items on the ballot in New Jersey this time is whether or not we're going to allow for the whether or not we want the legalization of marijuana in our state. Um, do we want that to happen in our state? Many states have legalized marijuana, and one of the reasons why they have legalized marijuana is that they feel like they can tax it, and it's a source of revenue for the state, just like alcohol is taxed. And I don't mean the sales tax. There is tax on alcohol before it ever gets to you, just like there's lots of tax on fuel that you put in your automobile before you ever put it into your gas tank. You ever notice that they don't charge you sales tax on fuel? That's because all the taxes are added into the price. Same thing with alcohol, except they still charge you a sales tax on top of all the other taxes. And so that is the goal then of legalizing marijuana for some states. Never mind that for recreational purposes, some argue that it should be decriminalized and available for adult use. But this raises a question then, because I so here, if I wanted to make my own wine, all right, I've got a vineyard. I'm going to grow my own grapes. I'm going to pick those grapes. I'm going to crush those grapes. I'm going to ferment those grapes. I'm going to make my own wine. I'm going to make my own beer. I'm going to build a still, and I'm going to make my own alcohol. That's perfectly legal. I can drink my own alcohol. I can share it with my friends. The minute I sell it to my friends, I'm in violation of the law. What about marijuana? If the state of New Jersey legalizes it, will I be allowed to grow my own marijuana? And if I can grow my own marijuana, is it only for my consumption? What if I give it to someone else? What if I sell it to someone else? These then are sort of moral dilemmas. Why do we then tolerate it and say that the government can tax alcohol if it goes through a sanctioned store? By the way, in Pennsylvania, it is a state-run store, state liquor store. But I'm not allowed to just sell it to my friends. So there again, we're talking about autonomy versus paternalism. But let's continue to talk about these other drugs. When it comes to drugs and legalization, there are a number of things that we need to consider. Should there be safe houses for people to use drugs? Places where they can go and they can legally use drugs in that location. In the Netherlands, they do have that. For example, in Amsterdam, there are places where people who are addicted to certain drugs, heroin, for example, they can go and they can get a legal dose of heroin but they also, in those places, they do try to provide treatment to reduce people's use or to help people break their addiction to those drugs. But if they want to get high, it's a safe place for them to get high. Should we have those in this country? What about needle exchanges? Is it moral then to provide clean needles to people, not their drug, to provide them with clean needles? So if they bring in a dozen dirty needles, to give them a dozen clean needles so that they're not passing diseases on to each other. They're not passing on anything that might contaminate their blood or anything like that. What about street drug tests? And by that I mean, should we be in the business of giving out tests so that if you do want to take a recreational drug that is illegal, should we have tests that are available at no charge so that you can test the potency of that drug? So if you're going to purchase some, or you purchase some heroin, you can test the potency of that to see if it's fentanyl versus heroin, to see if it's 90% proof versus if it's 50% baby powder. Should we do that? Should we allow that? Or is a needle exchange, is a street drug testing kit, is that encouraging people to take an illegal drug? There are other things. If we did, if the government did endorse, and there are places where this is the case, where they provide needle exchanges, they provide safe places for people to use drugs, there is then an often heard response to it. It goes by an acronym called NIMBY. NIMBY, NIMBY, not in my backyard. So there's very often a NIMBY response if we try to make it safe, either through needle exchanges or places where people can use, locations where people can use drugs safely. Oh God, I'm getting text from political campaigns. What about dispensaries? Places where people could buy these drugs. So fine, if you don't want to have a location where people can use them safely and legally, what if at least we took the dealers, the street dealers out of it, so that people aren't buying their drugs on the street and getting, for example, marijuana that's laced with something. True story. The first couple of times, if you don't want to hear your professor admit to doing something like this, tune this part out. But the first couple of times I used marijuana, it was fine. It was great. Nothing to be too excited about, to be honest with you. Actually the last time that I used marijuana, and this is going back 12 or maybe 15 years ago. I had gotten some marijuana that it was laced with something, and I have to tell you, I had a trip around the world. That stopped me. Had there been a dispensary where I could have gotten it, would I still be using it? I don't know. But should there be dispensaries? But the response is often to people, if you want to make it safe, if you want to take out the dealer, if you want to make it sanitary for people to use drugs, the response of neighbors is, I don't want it in my backyard. Yeah, you can do that, but not here. Well, where are we supposed to do that then if we're going to make it safe? A similar question can sometimes be asked of sex offenders. No one wants them to live in their neighborhood. Where are they supposed to live? Because people can be on the sex registry with a whole spectrum of things. So where are we if we make these things legal, um, for people who want to use drugs, um, where are we supposed to put these facilities? So let's just say for the sake of argument, that this ballot initiative that's on in New Jersey, let's just say marijuana is legalized for recreational use. What then do we do about the people who are currently in prison for use of marijuana, for possession of marijuana? Do we just let them out of prison? Do we keep them in prison? Do we expunge their records? Do we leave it on their records, but with a note saying at the time that they were arrested, it was against the law? How do we deal with them then in a situation like that? How would we respond to those sorts of situations? There's also, I think, something to be said, a moral issue, for looking at decriminalization of drugs versus keeping them illegal, but not punishing the users. So if you can find people who are, okay, fine, if you can catch the big time dealer, that is one thing. But is it really fair to punish the little guy who is using drugs? Is it really fair? The guy who has, an ounce of marijuana for his own personal use. Should that person then be punished, fined, or anything like that? Versus the guy who has a kilo. Where then would be the line for a situation like that? These are the moral dilemmas that we face when we talk about the legalization of marijuana or the legalization of any drugs, the street drugs. So it's the safety of it, the sanitization of it, making it clean for people to do. What do we do with the criminal justice system for people who have been punished for that? How do we address the fact that typically the people who are most likely to be punished for drug possession are minorities? This was very much true in the 80s and 90s when there was a crack. It was referred to as a crack epidemic. Crack was, a form of cocaine, and it was so inexpensive and cheap. It was mostly used by poor people, by minorities, versus nowadays where we talk about this heroin epidemic and we talk about treatment. So there are many people who will say there's a racial component to it because now we want to push treatment, we want to push sympathy, as opposed to in the 80s and 90s when it became lock them up and throw away the key. So even conviction for minor possession could get you multiple years, sometimes decades in prison if it was a multiple offense. Versus nowadays where we really want to push drug courts and treatment because the heroin epidemic, the problem with narcotics nowadays is very much come into the mainstream middle white class or white middle class. And so now it is a problem to be treated rather than punished by the law. Okay, so I'm going to post some videos for you to watch and you to think about. And I've already put up an assignment for you. I still want to address guns and free speech. I might do that I might just hold over. Let me look at the syllabus if I can hold that over. That way it gives you a chance to catch up on everything, um, so that you can do that for, I'll do guns and free speech and freedom of the press next week. Okay, thanks guys.